Hello, and welcome. This is my EDL 851 Module 12 case study. So, summarization of the case study. The principal, who we don't know the name, had visited Mrs. Stevens' classroom several times, and it is evident that she had been having difficulty with classroom management. She could not get any of the students' attention, any of the students to engage in learning. Um, though the students seemed disinterested in the classroom, there's no doubt Mrs. Stevens was intelligent and had an excellent background in subject matter, but she did not seem to know how to motivate her students. During the meeting, the post observation meeting, the principal found Mrs. Stevens to be hostile, irritable, and not open to any suggestions. This meeting ended with no agreeable conclusion after Mrs. Stevens became defensive in the principal, feeling as if no progress had been made. So the principal wanted to submit his evaluation to the superintendent in regards to being able to non-renew Mrs. Stevens, but before submitting it, he wanted to visit Mrs. Stevens' class one more time to reevaluate, um, where he found no improvement and left the classroom without addressing any topic as to why he was there. Um, so the issue was that this was the year where Mrs. Stevens was up for be tenured, or you can non-renew without having to deal with a lot of issue. So the principal, had to make that really important decision to see if that's something he wanted to do. So before submitting his recommendation to non-renew to the superintendent, he called Mrs. Stevens in for a conference to discuss the evaluation with her. After looking over the evaluation, Mrs. Stevens became angry and stated that the evaluation was inaccurate and unfair. She had had little supervision and guidance from either him or a supervisor, and blames her lack of success motivating students on his and her supervisor's inability to provide practical ideas for change. Before leaving the meeting, Mrs. Stevens was really upset and told the principal that she intended to put up a fight, even as far as taking it to court, as she feels that everything was unfair during the evaluation process and that the administration failed her. So, any legal or ethical issues, the school district has ethical obligation to provide proper professional development to help teachers succeed and be effective when teaching. And the school district has an obligation to provide highly qualified teachers to instruct um, students, and the school district has an obligation to provide a fair and appropriate education for students. Mrs. Stevens is entitled to a fair evaluation process as well as an opportunity to correct and improve upon her weaknesses. And legally, it can be very difficult to prove a teacher is ineffective and remove a veteran teacher from the position. So, as I stated earlier, that's the issue that the principal had with Mrs. Stevens, as far as trying to get him um, or trying to get Mrs. Stevens non-renewed before she became tenured was his issue. And then also, it could be easier to non-renew a probationary teacher rather than dealing with Mrs. Stevens as a non-probationary teacher. So that's why the principal wants to be proactive in making the decision now. So what exactly happened? The principal evaluates Mrs. Stevens multiple times and decides to non-renew um, her contract after poor evaluation, and then she is threatened to take the issue to court if he does not recommend her tenure and change the evaluation. So what do we know about the people? The principal is the one that's evaluating Mrs. Stevens. Ms. Stevens is not an effective teacher based on the evaluations. The principal reevaluated Mrs. Stevens even after their discussion. Um, the principal had not yet submitted his recommendations for the superintendent. And then what is unknown? So what is unknown is if any other administrator outside the principal had completed any of Mrs. Stevens' previous evaluations, and what were the results of them? Was there any feedback provided then? What professional development opportunities were provided with Mrs. Stevens for Mrs. Stevens? What others think of Mrs. Stevens as a teacher? So, like the students, other teachers, admin, parents, community, etc. What are the demographics of the students in Mrs. Stevens' class? Who is in charge of hiring and firing of the teachers? And then what's the relationship between the principal and superintendent? Will the superintendent support the principal? One other thing is, was this Mrs. Stevens' first year teaching, second year teaching? I know in the state of Colorado, you have 3 years of probationary status. So once you hit the first day of your fourth year, you're officially non-probationary anymore, and you're tenured. So just wanted to kind of see what the laws were in that state. So what we know about the place: Mrs. Stevens' observation took place in her classroom. And then they met in the principal's office. Meetings were held. What is unknown, the demographics of the school, location, size, and condition of the school, how large the school and the district are. Is this a rural or urban area? What grade level is she teaching? What subject area is she teaching? We don't really know that. So what we know about the program, the principal conducts teacher evaluations in the school. The principal is responsible for support from evaluations with individual leaders. Mrs. Stevens had been evaluated several times before by the principal and potentially other admin. And some of the unknowns are what professional development options has the school and district offered, especially to Mrs. Stevens. What role does the supervisor play in evaluation and/or professional development? What grade level subject does Mrs. Stevens teach? Are there any district level admin support that correlates to Mrs. Stevens' subject grade level? So is there like a science specialist? Is there a math specialist? Depends on what content area she teaches. What type of class and classroom Mrs. Stevens uses? How the school and district requires evaluations to be completed? How frequently? And is the school private or public? If it is a private or a charter school, it is a little different. I know tenure works a little different in Colorado with private schools and charter schools, so something we want to know. So reviewing and prioritizing the information. So if the principal and superintendent do not hire Mrs. Stevens, it may have negative or positive effect on the school environment, community, and students. So a lot of people may be affected. Stakeholders in this decision should include the admin within the school and possibly the district, so like superintendent, other teachers, students, parents, the community, and Mrs. Stevens. I do not believe all stakeholders should be involved in the actual decision. It is not really the business of the community and parents to be involved in hiring and firing decisions within the school and district. That's more just admin. There's a lot of unknown information in this case study, and therefore I do not feel that there's enough information to come to a clear and concise conclusion, which I'll get into in a little bit. How would I handle the situation? So how I would handle is I would go to the superintendent, ask for advice and support, kind of inform them of what's going on in the situation, how Mrs. Stevens is responding to everything, review the board policies and teacher evaluation and retention, make sure that I'm good on it to help support and back up my decision. Possibly ask for special permission for 1-year probation and continuation, so maybe get human resources involved. If that is granted, I collaboratively develop an improvement plan with Mrs. Stevens and have it signed by all parties. On the improvement plan, I'd incorporate in professional development learning geared towards classroom management and discuss professional development options with Mrs. Stevens and possibly enroll Mrs. Stevens in a mentor-mentee program if the district does have one. I know we do. It's called an induction program. You have to do it your first 2 years of getting your initial teaching license before you can turn it into a professional license. So that's kind of how I believe that the situation would be handled effectively. You don't want to go out on bad blood. So I think if you can try to get her to calm down and try to help her and show that, maybe she could buy into it. But it's worth a shot. So the pros and cons of my plan. Pros are get up to date on board. I'd be up to date on board policies and state laws revolving teacher tenure, covering all bases of support for Mrs. Stevens, more support and learning for Mrs. Stevens to get, and a lot of collaboration is happening amongst us. Some of the cons is, will Mrs. Stevens even be receptive to this plan? Mrs. Stevens can still be ineffective even after the probation year if we got granted that year. Mrs. Stevens get irritated with all the attention and directives and that she quits mid-year and leaves the school kind of in a bind. And still, we could still have a legal battle with Mrs. Stevens. So developing my plan, so like I mentioned earlier, ask special permission from the superintendent for a 1-year probation continuation. Definitely get with the plan and continually work on continually improving and helping Mrs. Stevens and have it signed by all parties. So once all parties are in agreement with the implementation plan, develop a mentor-mentee program with a teacher who is evaluated in the above average range to serve as kind of the mentor teacher or someone in a correlated subject. If there's another teacher in another school within the district or in the building, kind of help serve that. Have Ms. Stevens come co-teach a class with her mentor. This district will provide Ms. Stevens with classroom management, professional development, learning. Establish a schedule for observation and meetings, and evaluate the district policies in alignment with state laws. So the implementation of the plan. As future building leader, I believe the school should develop a better evaluation process, maybe train administrators in the process more. I feel like the principal also didn't really know how to handle it. He was kind of indecisive. He kind of went back and forth as to what he wanted to do, and then finally wanted to make the decision. Make sure the staff is all aware of the process. Provide additional professional development on staff evaluations. So kind of teach the staff from the admin side as to what they're going through. Having a mentor-mentee program, like I mentioned earlier, the induction program as a requirement for new hires. Look at state bills, laws, and possibly strengthen the board policies if necessary for termination of staff. So some reflection I had was I don't believe there's enough information to have a definitive answer to the situation. I believe that we should have been provided more information in regards to it. The best option for the situation was to give Mrs. Stevens another opportunity because we do not have any information on how many times she had been observed. We just knew that she had been observed many times. We also do not know the previous year's evaluation results, if there was one, unless she was a first-year teacher. I believe this option allows for all parties to assess their own practices, develop a better evaluation process and professional learning environment. This will definitely help me as a future building leader because there's always evaluation issues that arise within staff. On the teacher side of things, I always hear of issues from evaluations, and all teachers handle them differently. For example, Mrs. Stevens was very, very, kind of volatile with it, and I've seen teachers in our school do that. Me, I just kind of want to see me be in the green, and I'm good. But it's definitely the most disliked part of being an administrator, from what I've heard from a lot of people that are in admin. Here are my references. Thank you guys for listening to my case study. It's been one fun class, and once again, thank you guys.